Last month, the US announced that it was conducting a review of its AUKUS Security Pact with the UK and Australia, with some US defence officials apparently arguing that AUKUS is inconsistent with Trump's America First policy, and that the US shouldn't supply submarines to Australia in case the US needs them for a conflict in Taiwan. Unsurprisingly, this has raised eyebrows in Australia and put yet more strain on the long-standing US-Australia alliance, which was already fraying. So in this video, we're going to explain why AUKUS is in jeopardy, and what all of this means for US-Australia relations. We're getting ever closer to 1 million subscribers, and 68% of you aren't even subscribed yet. So lend us a hand and subscribe today. First, let's recap the 2025 Australian election. Until just a couple of months before the election in May, polls suggested that the Conservative Liberal National Coalition, led by Peter Dutton, would oust the incumbent Prime Minister Anthony Albanese's Labour Party. But as the election approached, Labour surged in support and secured a landslide victory, winning 94 out of the 150 seats in the House of Representatives. During the campaign, Albanese was more popular than Dutton, who was hurt by his proximity to US President Donald Trump. Dutton said in February that Trump was a big thinker and praised his art of the deal, and his campaign also had some Trump-esque policies, including huge cuts to Australia's public service, a Doge-style government efficiency unit, and a referendum on deporting criminals with dual citizenship. However, the Trump administration was unpopular with the Australian public, with a YouGov poll in April finding that 66% of respondents thought that Australia needs to develop more independence from the US on defence and national security, compared to just 39% in June of 2024. And more than 70% of respondents thought that Trump's policies would make Australia worse off. For context, earlier that month, Trump had announced his Liberation Day tariffs, including a 10% tariff on Australian goods. Now, Albanese and Trump were obviously never going to be best buds, but relations have gotten off to a rockier start than most imagined. Broadly speaking, there are two issues straining the US-Australia relationship: trade and defence. On trade, you might expect Trump to be relatively friendly to Australia, given that it's one of few countries that the US actually runs a trade surplus with. This is why Australia was only threatened with the basic 10% tariff on Liberation Day, but this didn't go down well with Albanese, who since demanded zero tariffs. Trade relations have also been complicated by Australia's economic relationship with China, which has long been Australia's largest trading partner. The US is pushing for Australia to reduce its trade with China, which Australia doesn't want to do. And Australia is also worried that US tariffs on China could undermine the Chinese economy, reducing demands for Australian exports. While on defence, the US has called for Australia to increase its defence spending from its current levels of about 2% of GDP to 3.5% of GDP as soon as possible. But under its current budget profile, Australia plans to increase its defence spending only modestly in the short term, to just 2.25% of GDP in 2028-29, rather than the more dramatic commitments made by countries like Germany, France, or the UK. One reason for this is that there just isn't much public support for increasing defence spending in Australia. An April 2025 survey by the University of Sydney found that only a third of Australians support increasing it, suggesting that a majority feel that the current level of spending is either appropriate or too high. And this sort of makes sense. In Europe, much of the public enthusiasm for increased defence spending is motivated by anxieties about Russia, but Australia doesn't have such an acute security threat on its doorstep. Furthermore, Albanese argued that it's up to Australia to decide its defence budget, that arbitrary GDP limits are unhelpful, and that defence needs should be established first and funding allocated afterwards, rather than the other way round. However, this week Australia's Foreign Minister Penny Wong hinted that the US may have cooled off on its demand for Australia to increase its defence spending, at least for now. However, the other defence-related issue in this relationship is AUKUS. In June, the US announced that it was conducting a 30-day review of the Biden-era AUKUS Security Pact, signed in 2021 between the US, UK, and Australia. Under the pact, Australia pays huge subsidies to both the US and UK's industrial bases to acquire between 3 and 5 US-built nuclear-powered attack submarines. This would massively upgrade Australia's military capabilities, as the US submarines are more advanced than Australia's diesel engine fleet, and would allow Australia to carry out long-range strikes against enemies. Now, even before the Trump administration was explicitly flirting with ditching the pact, there were anxieties in Australia that the US might not actually deliver the submarines on time. US shipbuilding is currently lagging behind schedule due to high costs and slow deliveries, and the US is struggling to meet its own targets. This is the main reason that Trump's Undersecretary of Defense, Elbridge Colby, who's leading the AUKUS review, is apparently, quote, skeptical of the pact's benefits for the US, and is wary of selling nuclear submarines in case the US needs them in a potential conflict over Taiwan. This AUKUS debacle has also restarted a wider debate in Australia about the country's dependence on the US. Former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull claims that Australia is being mugged over its billion-dollar payments for US submarines that may never arrive, with Australia forecast to spend up to $368 billion in total on AUKUS between now and the mid-2050s, and instead argues that Australia should develop its own, more self-reliant defence strategy. Albanese's government does appear to be making moves here, announcing last month that Australia would start talks on a defence and security pact with the EU, following the EU's recent deals with Canada and the UK. So where next for US-Australia relations? Well, it's hard to imagine much improvement, especially if the US withdraws from AUKUS. Neither Trump nor Albanese has really invested much effort into mending ties. Albanese decided to miss this year's NATO summit, and Trump skipped a meeting with Albanese at the G7 meeting last month, where he left early to deal with the Iran-Israel war, which means that the two leaders still haven't met. Perhaps there could be some respite if the two sides can agree on a trade deal before Trump's looming July 9th deadline. But this could be difficult if the Trump administration pushes Australia to reduce its trade with China, given that this has been the backbone of Australia's economic strength in recent decades. All of this plays into a broader feeling of chaos in the world at the moment. Whether it's wars, economics, or geopolitics, it feels like things are increasingly uncertain. And who's at the middle of all of that? Well, the United States. At one time, the US seemed to be a steady, stabilizing force in global politics, but it seems that those days are over, with American influence, popularity, and dominance on the decline. So in the next issue of our magazine, Too Long, we're discussing this shift, and the potential that we're currently observing the end of the American order. In that section of the magazine, we unpack everything from the collapse of democratic norms in the US to the decline of American soft power, and if the US can maintain its dominance in energy and technology. We also discuss the people who could pick up the reins from the US, like if China, Europe, or even a new multipolar order could replace America. This magazine is our longest ever, coming in at 76 pages, and it's full of our very best journalism and well thought through analysis. That goes beyond just the US too, with more than half of the magazine dedicated to other topics, from Germany's new focus on military might, the offshoring of migrants around the world, how Nigel Farage could become Britain's next Prime Minister, or our section where we ask a handful of experts what's really driving anti-establishment sentiment around the world. You can pre-order a copy of Too Long from our website right now, or you can subscribe to make sure that you never miss an issue going forward. And if you do, you'll also get 20% off every copy as long as you're subscribed. Plus, just this week, if you use code AmericanOrder, you'll get an additional 20% off any subscription, bringing down the price to as little as £6.40. So pre-order a copy now to get yourself all of that extra content and support the journalism that we do here at TLDR every single day.